Hello, brothers and sisters. Our first reading for the upcoming Sunday comes from the book of Chronicles. And this is the only time in the 3-year cycle of readings that we hear from this book. Now, Chronicles is the last book in the Hebrew Bible, and it summarizes everything that came before in a long historical narrative. And throughout the telling of Israel's history, there is one criteria by which Chronicles judges the events and the people of Israel's history. And that criteria is the temple. For Chronicles, the temple is the most important thing. It's the place where God resides. It's the place where Israel encounters God. And so the events that lead to the honoring of the temple and to the glorification of the temple, those are good events. And the events and the people who are against the temple and lead to the diminishing of the temple, those are bad things. And so the temple is the most important thing to this history. Now, our particular passage from Chronicles is the very end of the book of 2nd Chronicles. So this is the last passage of the Hebrew Bible. And in this passage, we hear of the worst thing that happens in in the Israelite history, which is the destruction of the temple. We hear how the Babylonians come, they destroy Jerusalem, they take the royal family hostage, and then they destroy God's house. This is as bad as it gets for the Israelites, for God's house, for the temple to be destroyed. Indeed, our very psalm is written in response to this event. And we hear in the psalm, what do we hear? By the rivers of Babylon, we sat mourning and weeping when we remembered Zion. On the poplars of that land, we hung up our harps. If I forget you, Jerusalem, may my right hand wither. May my tongue stick to my palate if I do not remember you, if I do not exalt Jerusalem beyond all my delights. And so this was a serious event for God's house to be destroyed. The one place to offer sacrifice, gone. It would be like if there were no more priests anymore. Pretty much all the sacraments. We would only have baptism left. But no more Eucharist, no more confession, no more confirmation, no more marriage, no more anointing of the sick. It's that serious of an event. But it doesn't end there, right? Because then the passage from Chronicles continues, and it tells us of a very good thing that happens, which is that the Babylonians don't stay in control. Instead, the Persians come in. They conquer the Babylonians, and Cyrus, king of the Persians, he has a vision from God, and this vision causes him to let the Israelites go home and rebuild the temple. And so, in this short little passage from Chronicles, we hear both the worst thing that happens in Israel's history, and then how God turns that around, right? Because before the destruction of the temple, the Israelites would have found it unimaginable that God's house would be destroyed. I mean, sure, Israelites might be punished, maybe they would lose their king, maybe there could be a famine or a sickness, but for God's house to be destroyed, at that point, God would be punishing himself, not the Israelites. God wouldn't do that. That's beyond what is possible. But it happened. It happened, and it didn't destroy God, and it didn't destroy the Israelites' relationship with God. God is so big, God is so powerful, that something worse than they could have imagined, even that doesn't get rid of God. Even that doesn't get rid of God's promises. And so we hear something similar in the Gospel of John, right? So Jesus, he's talking with Nicodemus, and he reminds Nicodemus of the serpents in the desert, how these serpents, they were killing the Israelites. They were biting them, killing them. And so God tells Moses to craft a bronze serpent. And if anyone is bitten by a serpent, to come to look at the bronze snake, and they would be healed. And so there in the desert with Moses, God took this terrible thing, this awful thing, and he turned it into a good thing, right? Serpents no longer were that by which people would be killed, but serpents became the thing by which people would be saved. And Jesus, he compares himself. He says, just as Moses raised up the serpent in the desert, so will the Son of Man be raised up. Right? So the destruction of the temple, that was a terrible thing. But I can think of something that would be worse. Worse than God's house being destroyed would be for God himself to be killed. For all of us to unite against the innocent man and to put him to death. To turn against God, to reject God completely. And that is what the Gospels, all four of them, proclaim that the people back then did, and that all of humanity, we do that together. And so this terrible thing happens, this awful thing that we participate in God's death. But that's not the end, because God, he takes this terrible thing, this awful thing. Like how could God's relationship with us survive this thing? And he turns it into the sign of his love for us. Because no longer is the cross this thing that condemns us, but it's something that redeems us, that saves us. And so now we gaze upon the cross, this terrible thing, and now we gaze upon it as the means of our salvation. And so this shows us that there's no limit to God's love for us, to his mercy, to his goodness, that nothing we can do can separate us from the love of God, and that no matter what happens, God is always present to us. And so I would invite you then to consider, what limit do you place on God? Maybe you've experienced, you've recall placing a limit on God in the past, and had your mind blown when that limit was destroyed, when it was taken away, when God showed that he was more than that limit. And so what limits do we place on God? What do we think our relationship with him couldn't survive? And then secondly, do we dare to pray for God to break that limit?